All credit to the Haslams for putting this on. This is just a marvelous event. I've dreamt of things like this happening in Australia, and it's wonderful to see medicinal cannabis on the agenda. It's exciting times in the cannabinoid field, and down in the psychopharmacology lab in Sydney, we've been active on this for quite a long time, as you just heard. But it seems that everything's coming to a focus now, and we've entered a really exciting time, both in terms of the science of cannabis and also in terms of, I guess, the political will behind the idea of change in legislation. The talk that I'm going to give features my two buddies here. We've got Dave Alsop and Nick Lintzeris, my partners in crime. That's taken in Tijuana. One of the joys of being an academic is that you get to go to interesting places all over the world, and we crossed the American border into Mexico, and I thought they looked like a couple of narco dealers. What do you reckon? They're looking much more respectable today, I'll tell you. But one of the joys of academic research is the people you meet and the people you get to work with, and these two are just wonderful to work with, and we have a lot of fun together indeed. It's not just Dave and Nick, though. There's actually, you may not be aware, but there's some really very high quality cannabis researchers and cannabinoid researchers in New South Wales. And I was very struck by Mike Baird's comments that we need the best minds in the business pushing this medicinal cannabis agenda forward. And there is some really high quality research going on in this state and in other states in Australia. And some of this is yielding very, very exciting discoveries indeed. And I've just named a few of the punters that are involved. So I work with a guy called Michael Cassiu who can synthesize cannabinoids from scratch. He's a very, very interesting medicinal chemist. There's another chap at Macquarie University, Mark Connor, who can express cannabinoid receptors and other receptors on cells in a vat, and then he can expose them to different cannabinoids and other drugs and work out the affinity of these drugs for the particular receptors. And that's very important research in pharmacology. He's a world leader in that regard. My colleague Tim Carl at the University of New South Wales has just used mice to show that cannabidiol in a mouse model can reverse some of the ravages of the brain changes that you see in Alzheimer's disease. So very interesting, cutting-edge research coming from Tim. We've got, down in Wollongong, we've got people who are vaporizing THC and CBD in Nadia Solovich's lab, and she's looking at the effects of THC alone, CBD alone, and the mixture on human behavior. And she's also sticking people in scanners as well to see how their brain changes with THC alone compared to CBD and a combination. Very exciting research, and nowhere else in the world is research like that being done. Very exciting indeed. We've got Dave and Nick over there who are experts in running clinical trials, and we've been doing trials on Sativex, which have been really interesting. We've also got pain specialists, and I earmarked Chris Vaughan as a real leader in cannabinoids on pain. He works in the fundamental mechanisms in the spinal cord and the brain through which cannabinoids alleviate pain, and does excellent work. With a guy called Jonathan Arnold at the University of Sydney, we're trying to unlock the basic cellular mechanisms through which CBD has these anticonvulsant effects that we've heard so much about over the last couple of days. And we think we've identified a novel mechanism, quite an unexpected one, that doesn't involve cannabinoid receptors, that underlies the ability of CBD to prevent seizures. And we'll be working pretty furiously on that over the next 2 or 3 months. It's exciting times in that regard. And also, Wendy Swift at the National Drug and Alcohol Research Centre has really pioneered the study of the potency of cannabis in Australia. And it was really her efforts that led us into a study that I'll tell you a little bit more about, where we analysed the cannabinoid content of cannabis in New South Wales. So this slide is basically just to let you know that the science is very much alive in your backyard. There's people doing really cool stuff in the science. And if Mike Baird wants people what's the best minds in the business working in this area, then he's already got some of them in his backyard. We need to mobilize these people together. We need basically an institute of cannabinoid science, I think, in New South Wales, where all these people can... where we can go from the very basic chemistry that someone like Michael Cassiu is doing all the way through the pharmacology, the animal models, the clinical trials, And we can lead the world in this area, there's no doubt about it, with the political will and the research funding behind us. In my own lab, we work at a number of different levels. So traditionally, I've been a rat person. I know it's not to everyone's liking, but I spent a lot of years basically putting drugs into rats. In fact, they say the definition of a drug is something that you put in a rat to get a research grant. And that summed up my life for about 20 years. Then about 7 or 8 years ago, I had a bit of a revelation that I just didn't want to work with rats all my life. And so I got to know these guys pretty well and other human researchers and started working more in human clinical trials, or what's called translational medicine or translational pharmacology, where you take the very basic findings that you make with cells or with mice and with rats and apply them to the big picture with human beings and apply them to medical problems. And that's been a great transition for me. That's really revolutionized my career, and I've had an awful lot of fun indeed. So we still work with rats and mice to a certain extent because they can answer questions that you can't always immediately answer with human beings. And we also do quite a lot of analytical toxicology. So we've got all sorts of expensive machines in the lab that allow us to, say, analyze the cannabinoid levels in people's urine or blood or in plants. And that's a very exciting pursuit as well. And we also go out to clinical sites and work with people who are cannabis users. Not because necessarily they have problems, although sometimes people do want to give up cannabis, and we're active in helping them do that if they do want to give up, but also just to understand what long-term cannabis use does to people, either beneficial or in some cases harmful. I think if you look at the history of funded research into cannabis in this country, Laurie Mather made the point a couple of days ago in a very interesting article in the Sydney Morning Herald, where he basically said that up until very recently, you could only get research funding in Australia to show that cannabis did something bad. And that was certainly my experience. We got a number of grants where we basically injected high doses of cannabinoids into rats, particularly adolescent rats. Rats have a teenage period that lasts for about 22 days, and we'd give, during this very truncated adolescence, we'd give them cannabinoids and see what it did to their brain. And sure enough, if you get the doses right and if you find vulnerable animals, then you can get long-term changes. And that, in fact, is what I did for a number of years, looked at these adverse effects, and there's one of our papers there showing that if you give THC chronically to adolescent rats, you can get long-term changes in their social behavior and their cognition. In a way, that was driven by necessity. To get the research funding to work with cannabinoids, you almost had to show that they were doing something bad, because the idea that they may have medicinal benefit, that they may be good for people, was really unpopular amongst the funding agencies. That's a message that they didn't want to hear. Now the situation has changed, and I think Tim Carroll's recent paper is a very good example of that, and showing that when you give CBD to mice that are genetically engineered to express some of the proteins that you find in the human Alzheimer's brain, that you can actually reverse some of the problems in that mouse Alzheimer's brain by giving cannabidiol. And this is the revolution that is underway in preclinical research. It's actually possible now, I think, to go to the NHMRC or the ARC, who are the main funding bodies in Australia, and pitch a project that is actually looking at the benefits of cannabinoids. I think they probably prefer it if it's a non-psychoactive cannabinoid. I think they probably prefer that it be CBD or THCV or CBN or one of these rather than THC. But slowly the idea will come to them, I think, that THC has a lot of potential as a medicine as well. We've recently written this article in The Conversation that some of you may have read, myself and Dave, which explores all these different cannabinoids. As you've heard from many of the speakers over the last couple of days, there's maybe 100 different cannabinoids in that plant. And the main one that gets you intoxicated, of course, is THC up the top. But in the article, we call the cannabinoids bad Scrabble because, it's like THC, CBD, try and think of a word that involves these letters. It's very difficult indeed. So I've represented some of the trace cannabinoids there as Scrabble letters just to reinforce that idea. But I think the idea that non-THC cannabinoids can have major therapeutic effects is extremely sexy and extremely timely at this point in the evolution of cannabinoid science. And we really know very little about these trace cannabinoids. We're kind of at the precipice looking down at a beautiful valley where we'll learn eventually the therapeutic effects down in that valley of each of these cannabinoids. We're starting to get signs of CBN, for example, having lovely sedative effects. CBC may have antidepressant effects. THCV may actually be very active against obesity and overeating. It's almost like a reverse Munchies effect that THCV has. And CBD, of course, we've heard a lot of the different things that it can do over the last couple of days. So somewhere in that plant, we may have the cure for cancer, we may have the cure for obesity, for diabetes, we may have all sorts of amazing therapeutic potential, but we need to do the work. We need to do the hard yards. We need to do the science. And I have a great deal of respect for all the case studies that we've heard over the last couple of days, and particularly this morning. But in the end, what we need is clinical trials. We need to be able to find hard scientific proof to convince the doctors, to convince the medical community that these things work. Because case studies, while they're often really interesting to hear and quite revealing, are never sufficient evidence to really convince doctors and the people that matter in public health and medical policy that a medicine is going to work. So that's the next stage that we need to go through. I think THC itself is very interesting. I think THCA is fascinating as well. It was only quite recently that I learned that most of the THC in the plant is actually in the form of THCA. What a dummy I was. I've been working with cannabinoids for 20 years and I didn't even know this. But it's in a non-psychoactive form, THCA, and you have to actually heat up the plant material above 150 degrees to liberate THC from THCA. So THCA is non-psychoactive, but it probably has all sorts of medical potential, therapeutic potential in itself. And we've heard a bit about juicing over the last couple of days, and I think that's very interesting indeed, the idea that with juicing, you don't heat up the plant material, but you have high levels of THCA. It's non-psychoactive, but you may get a great deal of therapeutic potential from that THCA. And then all of these other ones as well. Now let me talk a little bit about the typical Australian weed that you might buy at a music festival or from your friend or grow in your backyard. What does the typical Australian weed look like? And that's an idea that pestered my colleague Wendy Swift for many, many years. And I think it was back in 2005, she actually had the idea to try and set up a study to analyze samples of weed that had been seized by the police. And I think it was 7 years later when she actually had the regulatory approval to do that study. She had to be extremely patient, extremely tenacious, and work extremely hard to get this study off the ground. And there was lots of false starts. And the police were actually very cooperative in the end, but it had to be legally watertight. There was a huge amount of paperwork involved. So big applause to Wendy, I think, for pulling that off. Otherwise, we'd have no clue what the cannabis in Australia was actually like. We helped Wendy by doing the analysis in this potency study, and the police supplied us with, that's not the police, by the way, but but it was a bit like that. We had all these police-seized cannabis samples that were arriving in the lab over a period of time. Most of them were cannabis caution seizures, so the people involved weren't arrested. They just had 15 grams or less, so the cannabis was taken away from them and given to me, and we put it through a machine and analyzed all these different cannabinoids. Of particular interest was the CBD to THC ratio. Now, CBD as a sort of good cannabinoid in some ways that can moderate the effects of THC was of particular interest. And one of the reasons it was of particular interest was a paper that I think Zach mentioned yesterday, and that is a wonderful German study showing that CBD is able to have very strong antipsychotic effects in people with schizophrenia. So if you take the CBD by itself and give it to someone who's suffering an acute psychosis, it's just as effective as a standard antipsychotic drug. Yet it doesn't have the side effects of antipsychotic drugs. antipsychotic drugs that we use in Australia that are particularly successful are Zyprexa and Seroquel and Risperdal, and use of these is going through the roof in Australia at the moment, but they have major side effects. People in particular get diabetic, they get obese on these drugs, and their cognitive function slows down as well. So the ability of CBD to reverse antipsychotic effects is a major, major breakthrough if we can show this across a number of studies and implement it as a therapeutic alternative to existing antipsychotic drugs. But anyway, getting back to the analysis of cannabis, there's a general idea that if you smoke cannabis that has THC and CBD in it, you get a sort of mellow, pleasant, somewhat euphoric high. But if you smoke high THC, then you have a higher propensity to getting an edgy, anxious sort of high. I know not everyone will agree with that. It's my interpretation of a literature that is less than complete, but I think there's a fair amount of scientific evidence that supports that proposition. So if that is correct, then you would hope that the cannabis that people are smoking in Australia has a fair amount of CBD in it. At least a wee bit, and maybe not too much THC. And that was one of the main things of interest in the Potency study that we did. We wanted to work out whether there was any CBD on board. And what we found out is that basically there's not. There's very, very little CBD in more than 200 samples that we got from the police that had been seized all around New South Wales, all different areas of New South Wales. There's probably about 5 samples that had reasonable or appreciable levels of CBD in them. We had relatively high THC content. When you work out the total THC by adding the THC to the THC acid, you're up about 15% THC in potency. But the overall concentration of CBD is below 0.1%. So there's hardly any CBD being smoked in the state as far as we know. We also looked at a whole lot of other trace cannabinoids, and there was very little THCV, very little CBC, a little bit of CBG, which is the precursor of both THC and CBD, so you'd expect that. But basically, we don't have many of the interesting therapeutic non-psychoactive cannabinoids in the weed that's been smoked in the state at the moment. We did a wee follow-up study with the police, and they gave us larger seizures where we knew that it was actually from an outdoor plantation or from an indoor hydroponic setup. With street seizures under the Cannabis Caution Scheme, you're never sure where the cannabis is being grown, but in this study, we actually knew the provenance, where the sample had come from, either indoor or outdoor. And we sort of thought that maybe the outdoor stuff would have heaps of CBD in it, and the hydro would be the stuff that has no CBD and lots of THC. In the end, there wasn't really that much difference between them. There was no overall difference in THC content, and both the indoor and the outdoor grown cannabis had very low levels of CBD. So that pattern we saw in the street seizures continued with the indoor and outdoor seizures. It's a slight difference with CBG, with the outdoor samples having higher CBG levels. So that was quite an interesting outcome, and we published it in a free access journal called PLOS1. So if you're interested in the data, you can just go to the PLOS1 journal and you can download all the data and our account of this particular study. And it was the first potency study ever done in Australia. Also interesting, in various trials where we've worked with cannabis users, including the Sativex study that David will tell you about, we took blood out of these users and we could look at the levels of cannabinoids in regular cannabis users. And we figured if the plants are telling us there's no CBD in the stuff that's being smoked, then when we take, say, 50 or 100 users and analyze their blood, then there should be no CBD in their blood either. And that's exactly what we found. When you analyze the bloods of regular cannabis users for CBD, you find there's none on board at all. But then when you give them Sativex, then the CBD suddenly appears. See that wee peak in the middle? That's after they've had their dosing of Sativex, which contains 1 part THC to 1 part CBD. And then when you take them back off the Sativex, then their CBD levels plummet. So the plants and the blood of regular cannabis users agree that there's hardly any CBD out there being used. What do we do about this? Well, in a way, if you buy the idea that CBD is antipsychotic and maybe can moderate, give additional health benefits to cannabis when it's consumed, we should be trying to get a program going where we introduce CBD into the weed that people are consuming, or at least give people the option of having high CBD strains. And I think there's been some comment over the last couple of days about the Cannatonic cannabis strain, which is 1 part THC to 1 part CBD, roughly. And it would, I don't know how to do this politically. Maybe some people have got ideas about how we could implement this. But I think overall in Australia, we have to be much more savvy in the way that the Americans are about the different strains that are available and the different medicinal properties that they may have for different disease states. And we have to realize that cannabis is not cannabis, that it's a whole variety of mixtures of cannabinoids, and tailor our use of different cannabis products according to the application that we have for them. The other thing that's interesting, and which we're doing some studies on, are the terpenes. And just a little background there, showing that the terpenes, which are not cannabinoid molecules at all, are usually quite fruity, aromatic compounds, much lighter than cannabinoids. There's increasing evidence that we've heard again from a few of the speakers today and yesterday, that they may have medicinal compounds, properties as well, and that there may be entourage effects where the cannabinoids and the terpenoids interact. And that's another area where we're getting into at the moment, and hopefully we'll be able to do some basic research on terpenoid-cannabinoid interactions. One study we've just completed was just analyzing the odor of different samples of cannabis. It's actually, when you smell cannabis, it's not cannabinoids you're smelling, it's the terpenes that you're smelling. They give you all the odor components. And we wondered if, people often say they can smell cannabis and tell you what the cannabinoid content is. They go, oh, that smells really strong, or that smells like it wouldn't do very much. It's kind of been in someone's cupboard for a couple of years. So we did an analysis where we looked at the THC content of different samples of cannabis relative to what was in the head space, in the aroma space above the plant, where all the terpenoids are to be found. And we found, that's a typical chromatogram, and the different terpenes that we can, terpenoids that we can isolate. Basically, we found that there was a huge difference in the terpenoid content according to the amount of THC in the plant. So with the high THC plants, you get a lot of the really smelly terpenes on the chromatogram. And the low THC, you get very few of them indeed. And we actually got a few people in the lab to sniff these samples and rate how strong they thought they were. And they were surprisingly accurate. And people are obviously coding strength by the terpene aroma coming off the plant, and that was quite an interesting finding. So, I could go on all day about all the different research that we're doing, but I've got a gig tonight with my band in Sydney, so I've got to get back, play keyboards in a soul band. So I'm going to hand you over to these two. Let me just make a couple of final observations. I'm strongly supportive of this movement. I think it's terrifically important. I really admire what Mike Baird is doing. I admire what Richard DiNatale is doing. As scientists, we want to help as much as possible in that process. In particular, to do important clinical trials, to do the basic science through which we can understand how cannabinoids are of medicinal benefit, and also to get into the media and educate people about cannabinoids as well. There's a whole world of science there that's really exciting, that's really sexy. People have been saying that doctors need to learn more about cannabinoids. I'm 100% behind that as well. I don't think medical education at the moment goes there, apart from to point out a weak association between cannabis use and psychosis in some people. We need much more of an emphasis on the benefits of the plant rather than the hazards. Thank you very much.